It was still dark on Detroit's east side when the feds moved in quiet. The date was October 4th, 2013, and the whole block was asleep until flashbangs cracked the morning open. Doors splintered, boots hit floors, and gunfire echoed through a hallway that smelled like gun oil and fear. Inside, a man shouted from his bedroom, clutching a pistol, half naked, yelling that they were hitting the phantoms. By sunrise, the streets were crawling with agents, and the city's most feared black biker gang was laid out in cuffs. The feds claimed they had stopped one of the biggest biker massacres in American history, but the truth ran deeper, born years before, inside Detroit's outlaw streets. The story really started back in the late 60s, when the whole country was falling in love with motorcycles and rebellion. Around 1968 or maybe 1969, in Chicago's South Side, a crew of black riders came together and called themselves the Phantoms Motorcycle Club. They didn't look or act like the Hells Angels or the Outlaws who ruled the highways back then. The Phantoms were different. They were integrated, rough, and didn't care what brand of bike you rode as long as you could handle it. They had brothers who rode on Harleys, Suzukis, even Yamahas, and they all carried the same fire inside. What mattered most wasn't the brand of your ride, but your loyalty to the patch. And that patch wasn't just decoration. It showed a ghost holding a scythe standing over a tombstone, a mark that told the world who they were. Losing that patch meant losing your manhood, and in the Phantoms world, that could get you beaten, expelled, or worse. When the 70s came around, the Phantoms drifted north into Detroit, and that's where they found their real identity. Detroit, with its factories, its noise, and its hustle, became the mother chapter, the heartbeat of the Phantoms MC. The city was full of working men who spent weekdays under grease and steel, then threw on leather vests on weekends to ride hard and party harder. Most of them were mechanics, truck drivers, or ex-cons who had done time and came back with a chip on their shoulder. Inside their clubhouses, walls were covered in flags, gun racks, and patches from rival clubs they had snatched. Those stolen rags were hung upside down on what they called the dead wall, a silent middle finger to anyone foolish enough to cross them. Their rules were simple. Loyalty came before family, women were property, and outsiders were never trusted. To them, regular citizens were just civilians, soft people who didn't understand the life. Their motto said everything about who they were: Phantoms forever, forever Phantoms. It wasn't just a saying, it was a blood oath. You left only through death or betrayal, and either way, the streets always remembered your name. By the time the Phantoms settled in Detroit, the city was already crawling with biker crews fighting for turf and respect. The Highwaymen MC had been around since the 50s, calling themselves the kings of Michigan's roads. Then there were the Outlaws MC, part of a nationwide network with deep roots around the Great Lakes. On the black side, you had the Satan Sidekicks MC, the Sin City Disciples, and the Hell's Lovers, all grinding for position in the same gritty scene. It was a crowded map, and everybody wanted to be top dog. The Phantoms rolled into that mix, claiming they were the toughest thing Detroit had ever seen. They weren't wrong either. Their members were fearless, unpredictable, and loud with it. They partied like rock stars, but fought like soldiers, and they didn't mind drawing heat from other clubs if it meant building their name. The Hell's Lovers MC had the strongest presence around that time, mostly mixed race, but with deep Chicago roots, just like the Phantoms. At first, there was mutual respect, but that piece was thin. Nobody wanted to play second to anyone, and pride was like fuel poured on every small argument. In that world, respect wasn't handed out. It had to be taken with fists, guns, or gasoline. Bar fights became test runs for future wars. A spilled drink or a wrong look at a party could turn into a parking lot shootout. Even charity bike runs weren't safe. It was always about proving who had more backbone, who rode harder, who was willing to die for their patch. Detroit became a pressure cooker for outlaw culture, and every club watched the Phantoms closely. People said they carried themselves with a kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing they were different. They weren't just bikers, they were soldiers tied together by history, race, and code. They weren't afraid of the white clubs, and they didn't care about biker politics either. In a city already full of guns and grudges, the Phantoms were about to turn the streets into something darker, something that would one day make Detroit's name echo through every outlaw clubhouse in America. By the time the Phantoms had locked their name into Detroit, the club was already moving different from every other biker set. Their top man, Antonio Mr. Tony Johnson, wasn't just running motorcycles. He was also a vice lord, 3-star general holding rank across the whole state of Michigan. In the streets, that title meant power. It meant he had soldiers from the west side of Chicago to Inkster and Highland Park who respected his name. The Phantoms weren't just pushing bikes anymore. They were running like a hybrid crew, part biker, part street mob. Their national enforcer, Marvin Chosen One Nicholson, was another vice lord with deep street ties. He was known around Detroit as the Muscle, the one who handled the dirty work when words didn't fix things. He had pulled both in biker bars and in the back alleys where the vice lords ran business. Mr. Tony's leadership turned the Phantoms into something different. They didn't just ride together, they moved like a full-blown organization. If Johnson made a call, men showed up. If he wanted somebody found, they got found. When he rode through the city, clubs like the Satan Sidekicks, Sin City Disciples, and Hell's Lovers paid attention. Everyone knew he had connections beyond the biker world. The vice lords gave him manpower, protection, and respect. Inside the Phantoms clubhouse, Tony preached discipline. He wanted his members to act like soldiers. That meant no disrespect, no weakness, and no outsiders in club business. He ruled through loyalty and fear, and people followed because crossing him wasn't smart. His lieutenants like Brian P.C. Sorrell, Sherman Tank Brown, and Christopher Murder Odom enforced that code on the street. Under Mr. Tony, the Phantoms weren't just another motorcycle club in Detroit. They were a growing power structure that could call in both bikers and gang members if war ever came their way. By 2012, the streets around Detroit were already tense. The Phantoms were deep in it, trying to dominate every other black biker crew in the city. Their first big problem came with the Satan Sidekicks MC, another all-black club that had been around since the 70s. The Sidekicks weren't bowing to Mr. Tony's leadership, and that rubbed him the wrong way. Johnson wanted unity, but he wanted it under his flag. When the Sidekicks refused to meet with him for peace talks, he took it as a straight-up insult. From that moment, he gave a standing order to his brothers. If you see a sidekick, snatch his vest. That vest was a man's identity, his pride, and his protection. Taking it was like taking his soul. So Phantoms started moving through gas stations, biker bars, and street corners looking for sidekicks to humiliate. The fights were brutal. Men got stomped, pistol whipped, and stripped of their rags in public. One sidekick was beaten so bad his head swelled up like a melon, and word of it spread across Detroit's biker circles fast. The violence wasn't just a message, it was a warning. That summer, the Hell's Lovers MC tried to calm things down. They hosted a party at their spot in Detroit, trying to bring the clubs together under one roof. But when the Phantoms showed up, they didn't come to dance. They stormed the place, pulled a sidekick into the back room, and beat him with pistols until the walls shook. Other Phantoms stood guard at the doors, guns in hand, blocking anyone from stepping in. Even the Hell's Lovers couldn't stop the chaos in their own clubhouse. After that night, Detroit's biker world changed. The Phantoms had proven they weren't just rowdy riders looking for fun. They were organized, fearless, and ready for blood. Inside their own clubhouse, somebody painted new words on the wall: ride and kill. That became the new code. The Phantoms weren't chasing peace anymore. They were chasing dominance. Late October 2012, a few months before the Detroit chaos reached full speed, the Phantoms made a move that would put them on every lawman's radar. A group of them rode down to Columbus, Ohio, to a party hosted by the Zulus Motorcycle Club, another respected black club with chapters in the Midwest. The Zulus' national president, Keith "Red" Foster, was in the building that night, and the atmosphere was calm until a Phantom bumped into a Zulu member near the bar. Nobody remembers who threw the first punch, but once it started, it spread like wildfire. Chairs flew, bottles broke, and before anyone could cool it down, William Frazier, the vice president from the Phantoms Pontiac chapter, pulled a gun and started shooting. 2 men got hit, including Keith Foster himself, and suddenly the room went dead quiet except for people screaming. Frazier and his brothers ran straight for the door, jumped on their bikes, and vanished into the night. By morning, both victims were in the hospital, and the Zulus were furious. A hit on a national president was no small thing. Word spread fast through the Midwest biker circuit, and everyone wanted to see what the Zulus would do. To avoid all-out war, Mr. Tony Johnson got involved personally. He drove to Cleveland to meet with Zulu leaders, offering a peace deal and even paying compensation from the Pontiac chapter. That meeting cooled things off just enough to stop retaliation, but the damage was done. The Phantoms' reputation changed overnight. They weren't just known as riders anymore. They were now seen as shooters. That Columbus shooting put the feds on alert. The ATF started watching quietly, taking notes and building names. They didn't know it yet, but that one wild night in Ohio would become the start of a much bigger storm headed straight for Detroit. By early 2013, the Phantoms were deep in every kind of hustle across Detroit. They had their hands in stolen bikes, drugs, and guns moving through back garages and truck lots across 7 Mile and East McNichols Road. The Detroit chapter president, Carl Fats Miller, was one of the most trusted men in the club. He had earned that trust through years of loyalty, violence, and leadership. Everyone thought he would die a phantom. Nobody ever imagined he would become the man who helped destroy them. In May 2013, Miller rolled out with Brian P.C. Sorrell for what was supposed to be a quick job. They planned to snatch a Harley parked behind a local shop in Livonia, thinking it was clean. But as soon as they loaded it into their van, the cops swarmed in. When officers searched the vehicle, they found a gun hidden under the seat, and both men were arrested on the spot. That gun turned everything into a federal case. Facing years in prison, Miller sat in a holding cell, realizing he didn't have many options left. The feds knew who he was. They knew he was high-ranking inside the Phantoms, and they offered him a deal. If he helped them bring down his own brothers, they'd cut his sentence and pay him for information. Miller took it. From that moment, he became a confidential informant for the ATF. Within weeks, he was back inside the clubhouse pretending nothing had changed. He wore a wire during meetings, cookouts, and late-night sit-downs. Every joke, every order, every threat, the feds heard it all. He recorded Mr. Tony Johnson, Marvin Chosen One Nicholson, and other top members talking about stolen guns, drug runs, and upcoming hits. The agents couldn't believe their luck. They had never seen a chapter president wearing a wire inside a national outlaw club. Nobody suspected him. In biker culture, betrayal was unthinkable. Wearing a wire was worse than killing a brother. But Miller was in deep now, feeding the feds constant updates while smiling in photos beside men who trusted him with their lives. Every handshake, every toast, every secret whispered over whiskey was being copied, filed, and stored in an FBI office downtown. Detroit's deadliest biker crew was already falling apart, and they didn't even know it. By September 2013, tension between the Phantoms MC and the Satan Sidekicks MC had reached boiling point. There had been fights at bars, threats on social media, and even cars shot up outside the East Side biker strip. One night around 2 a.m., Carl Fats Miller rode out with a crew of Phantoms looking to settle something. They were hunting for any sidekick they could find. They rolled past the Soul Devils Clubhouse on Harper Avenue, and that's where they spotted Leon Slider McGee and his wife standing near a black SUV. The Phantoms pulled over, and words turned to shouting within seconds. Fists flew, bottles broke, and someone pulled a gun. In the chaos, a shot cracked through the night and hit McGee straight in the face. He dropped instantly, while screams filled the lot. Another Phantom, Brian P.C. Sorrell, jumped into the fight but got stabbed in the stomach by one of the Sidekick's friends. Blood was everywhere, and both men ended up rushed to the hospital under fake names. Within hours, the news hit Detroit's biker network. The word was that the Phantoms had gone too far again. Back at the clubhouse, Mr. Tony was furious. He called a meeting that lasted until sunrise, pacing the floor and yelling that his brothers had made him look weak. He didn't know his chapter president, Carl Miller, had reported every detail of the shooting to the ATF that same night. Agents had the time, the location, and even the names of everyone present. They were already mapping out indictments while the Phantoms were still arguing about who pulled the trigger. Inside the club, paranoia started spreading. Some members thought the feds had an informant, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Everyone trusted Fats too much. He was one of them. The problem was he was already wearing the wire that would eventually put most of them in prison. The gas station Bloodshed wasn't just another fight. It was the spark that lit the fuse. The feds were listening closely now, and the Phantoms were about to step straight into their own downfall. Just a few weeks after that bloody night, tragedy struck again. On September 27, 2013, longtime Phantom member Stephen Shoeboots Caldwell was riding with his close friend Andre He-Man Swift through Detroit's west side near Plymouth Road. It was a quiet evening until a dark SUV pulled up beside them at the light. Before they could react, the windows dropped and gunfire ripped through the air. Caldwell was hit multiple times, one bullet tearing straight through his back. Swift tried to pull him toward the curb, but the SUV sped off into the night, leaving both men bleeding on the pavement. Caldwell was rushed to Sinai Grace Hospital, but his injuries were too severe. He died a few hours later with friends crowding the waiting room. To the Phantoms, Shoeboots wasn't just another rider. He was an elder, one of the old heads who helped build the Detroit chapter in the 70s. He was also a childhood friend of Mr. Tony Johnson, and that made his death personal. When the news hit, Tony lost it. He called everyone in. Witnesses said he was crying and shaking while holding a phone, yelling that somebody was going to pay. "They woke up a giant," he said. 10 of them won't be enough. That same night, the clubhouse went into lockdown. Everyone was armed. They patrolled the block around Outer Drive and 7 Mile, waiting for any rival to slip through. The police started looking into the murder, but no one was talking. Detectives believed it might have been retaliation for the gas station fight, possibly involving members of the Hell's Lovers MC or Satan Sidekicks. But inside the Phantoms, logic didn't matter anymore. Grief had turned into rage. Tony began calling meetings with his top lieutenants, including Marvin Chosen One Nicholson, Tank Brown, and PC Sorrell, plotting what they called payback. Members started buying ammunition in bulk, pulling maps of rival clubhouses, and sharing names of anyone rumored to have pulled the trigger. They wanted revenge, not justice. For weeks, the talk inside the Phantoms clubhouse grew darker. Some wanted to hit a rival member's funeral. Others talked about setting fire to a club's building while people were inside. The mood was cold and focused. Everyone wanted blood. The Phantoms weren't thinking about the feds anymore. They weren't thinking about Carl Miller or who might be listening. They just wanted to kill whoever they thought took Shoeboots from them. By the time September turned into October, Detroit's east side was crawling with tension. Phantoms rode in packs wearing bulletproof vests under their cuts. The streets were whispering about a war coming. The club that once lived by loyalty and brotherhood was now fueled by grief and revenge. And with every meeting recorded through Miller's hidden wire, the feds were listening to every word, waiting for the exact moment to strike. The Phantoms were angry, armed, and surrounded, but they didn't know it yet. They were already at the edge, and one wrong move would bring everything crashing down. After the murder of Stephen Shoeboots Caldwell, the Phantoms were out for vengeance. Antonio Mr. Tony Johnson swore he would make Detroit bleed until somebody paid for it. In his mind, the Hell's Lovers MC had ordered the hit, and he was convinced no one else could have done it. Caldwell had been close to him since their Chicago days, and losing him felt personal. Inside the Phantoms' Detroit clubhouse, Johnson gathered his top men for meetings that went late into the night. Around the table sat Marvin Chosen One Nicholson, Sherman Tank Brown, Brian PC Sorrell, and a few others he trusted. The air smelled like liquor, smoke, and anger. They talked about war, like it was already decided. Johnson told them the only way to earn back respect was to wipe the Hell's Lovers off the map completely. He broke it down into 3 clear phases. The first was to hit selected members of the Hell's Lovers around Detroit, especially their leadership. The second was bolder. Wait until the Lovers held a funeral for one of their fallen and then storm it with guns blazing. The last phase would take it national, spreading attacks to other Hell's Lovers chapters in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The plan wasn't talk anymore. They were collecting guns, buying extra clips, and scouting funeral homes. Inside that room, Carl Fats Miller, their Detroit president, sat silently. The others didn't know he was wearing a wire. Every word, every death threat, every plan to ambush was being recorded and sent straight to the ATF. Miller stayed calm, pretending to be all in, though inside he was breaking apart. He knew one wrong move could get him killed before the feds could even react. When the FBI heard the tapes, they realized the Phantoms were about to stage a massacre that could spark the biggest biker war in U.S. history. The investigation jumped to high alert overnight. Johnson was holding war council meetings every other night, while guns and stolen vehicles were passed between members. In the streets, everything looked quiet. Nobody knew that the feds were already listening, waiting for the right moment to move in and shut the whole thing down. Just before sunrise on October 4th, 2013, Detroit went from silent to chaos. Around 6 a.m., federal agents hit 20 locations at once across Michigan in one of the biggest joint operations between the FBI, ATF, and Detroit police. The target was the Phantom's MC. At a house on Edinburgh Street, agents surrounded the home of Marvin Chosen One Nicholson. Inside, he woke up to the sound of flashbangs and boots slamming doors. He grabbed a pistol and fired 4 shots through his bedroom door before he even knew who was outside. The bullets missed an agent by inches before a battering ram crushed the frame open. Nicholson was tackled on the floor, half naked, and still trying to fight. Across town, Antonio Johnson was taken down without warning. Agents stormed his spot near East 7 Mile Road, finding multiple guns, bulletproof vests, and a stack of club papers. At the same time, teams were arresting Sherman Tank Brown, Brian P.C. Sorrell, and several Detroit chapter lieutenants. The whole club was surrounded before anyone could pick up a phone. By noon, 14 members were in custody. They were charged under RICO for conspiracy, firearms trafficking, and attempted murder. Inside the evidence boxes were detailed maps of Detroit neighborhoods, funeral homes marked with X's, and written notes describing green light targets. One notebook even called the Phantoms an outlaw club at all times, matching the words Miller had recorded weeks earlier. When news hit the streets, Detroit's biker world froze. The Hell's Lovers went silent, realizing how close they had come to losing dozens of men in one strike. The Phantom's name, once spoken with fear, now became a symbol of downfall. Their empire didn't collapse from rivals or police chases. It fell apart from a wire hidden in their own clubhouse. By 2014, the Phantom's story had turned from street legend to courtroom drama. Federal trials began inside the U.S. District Court in Detroit, and the room was packed with reporters, families, and old club members watching history crumble. The biggest shock came when the defendants found out who had snitched. It was Carl Fats Miller, their own Detroit president. When Miller walked into the courtroom, eyes followed him like a ghost had entered. He took the stand and testified for a full week. The prosecution played audio recordings of Johnson crying over Shoe Boot's death, vowing revenge, and mapping out funeral attacks. On the tapes, you could hear laughter, gun talk, and Johnson saying, "We're gonna get every last one of them." It was raw and impossible to deny. Miller sat calm as his former brothers stared daggers through him. Marvin Nicholson shook his head slowly, while Tank Brown whispered curses under his breath. The whole courtroom felt heavy. Every tape they played sounded like another shovel of dirt on the Phantom's grave. A few defendants couldn't take the heat and flipped. Mo Williams and June Valdez turned into government witnesses, telling prosecutors about the hit plans and stash houses. Defense lawyers tried to fight it, saying all that talk happened while everyone was drunk and angry. They called it barroom bragging, not conspiracy. But the prosecutors had Miller's tapes, the guns, and notebooks full of hit lists. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came down like a hammer. Antonio Johnson was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Marvin Chosen One Nicholson got 40 years. Brian P.C. Sorrell was handed 21 years, while Tank Brown and DeMarcus Shamonte got between 8 and 10 years each. Others caught shorter sentences, but lost everything that made them free men. When it ended, the brotherhood that once called itself untouchable was finished. The Phantom's clubhouse stood empty, their colors boxed up as evidence, and their loyalty shattered by a microphone hidden inside a biker's vest. In the end, the street didn't take them out. It was their own trust that killed the Phantom's MC from the inside out. When the dust finally settled, Detroit was quiet again, but the silence carried memories of what almost happened. The Phantom's MC was broken down to a shadow of what it once was. Their clubhouse doors were locked, bikes sold, and patches buried in court files. Antonio, Mr. Tony Johnson, and Marvin Chosen One Nicholson sat behind bars growing old, replaying the decisions that cost them everything. Carl Fats Miller, the man who recorded it all, disappeared into witness protection, his name forever banned from outlaw circles. The Hell's Lovers MC survived untouched, while every other Detroit club learned how close the streets had come to war. In outlaw culture, betrayal is the worst sin, but sometimes survival comes from the same thing. The Phantoms didn't fall to enemies or cops chasing bikes down the freeway. They fell because loyalty blinded them. Detroit remembers the night the city almost exploded and how one brother with a wire saved it from turning into a battlefield.